You notice it only after the fact. The concession comes easier. The pause is shorter. The resistance that once held your ground is gone, replaced by something softer, something negotiable. Fatigue does not announce itself as weakness. It disguises itself as reason. You tell yourself it is practical to give a little, to avoid friction, to close the deal quickly. But what you are really doing is lowering the standard you once enforced without question. Discipline is not tested when you are sharp. It is revealed when your body is heavy, when your mind is slow, when silence feels easier than assertion. In those moments, you begin to bargain with things you once considered non-negotiable. Not because they changed, but because you did. The line did not move. You stepped back from it. That is the shift. And most never see it happening. It starts with small permissions. You sit across from someone, or stand in a moment that requires a decision, and you feel the drag inside your body. Your responses are slower. Your awareness narrows. You are no longer operating from clarity, but from reduction. Fatigue strips away excess, but it also strips away structure. What remains is not discipline. What remains is impulse shaped by convenience. When you are rested, you hold the line without thinking. There is no internal discussion. The boundary exists as part of you. It does not require defense because it is already decided. But when you are tired, the boundary becomes a question. And once something becomes a question, it becomes negotiable. You begin to introduce alternatives. Just this once. It's not a big deal. I can adjust later. These are not decisions. These are exits. Each one opens a small gap between who you are and what you do. And in that gap, identity starts to fragment. Fatigue creates a false sense of urgency. You want resolution, not correctness. You want the interaction to end, not to be aligned. So you give ground, not because it is right, but because it is easier. The body seeks relief, and the fastest form of relief in conflict is concession. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They believe it is built through intensity, through moments of high performance, through visible acts of control. But discipline is not forged in those moments. It is preserved in the quiet, degrading hours where nothing feels sharp and everything feels optional. The tired version of you is not a separate person. It is you without reinforcement. No energy, no tension, no edge. Just baseline identity. And if your baseline identity allows negotiation under pressure, then your discipline is conditional. It only exists when supported. That is not discipline. That is dependence. Watch how quickly standards dissolve when the body is compromised. You accept things you would normally reject. You delay responses you would normally execute. You tolerate behavior you would normally correct. Not because your values changed, but because your capacity to enforce them weakened. Enforcement is the core. Not belief. Not intention. Enforcement. Anyone can claim a standard when they feel strong. But the standard only exists if it is enforced when you are weak. That is the measure. That is the only measure. This is why fatigue is dangerous. Not because it makes you slower, but because it makes you flexible in the wrong places. It bends what should remain rigid. And once something rigid bends repeatedly, it does not return to its original form. It adapts. Permanently. So negotiation increases, not as a strategy, but as a symptom. A signal that the structure underneath is no longer holding. And every time you allow it, you train the next version of yourself to do the same, but faster, and with less resistance. Fatigue does not just weaken resistance. It alters perception. What once felt unacceptable begins to feel tolerable. Not because it improved, but because your ability to measure it degraded. Standards require sharpness to maintain. When sharpness disappears, so does accuracy. You begin misjudging weight. A demand that should feel heavy now feels manageable. A compromise that should feel costly now feels minor. This distortion is subtle, but it is consistent. And because it is consistent, it becomes trusted. That is where the shift deepens. You are no longer aware that you are lowering the standard. You believe you are adapting. You believe you are being efficient. But efficiency without alignment is erosion. It removes friction, but it also removes structure. The body plays a role in this that most ignore. When you are tired, your posture changes. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your voice loses tension. These are not cosmetic shifts. They are signals. And others read them instantly. Negotiation is not only verbal. It is physical. When your body presents uncertainty, the other side adjusts. They press slightly more. They wait slightly longer. They challenge where they would normally comply. And because you are already compromised, you do not correct it. You accept the new pressure as normal. So the negotiation expands without a single word being spoken. This is how ground is lost silently. You think negotiation happens in statements, in offers, in counteroffers. But most of it happens before language. It happens in presence. In stillness. In whether you hold or release tension at the right moment. Fatigue disrupts that control. You shift your weight. You break eye contact too early. You respond too quickly just to move things forward. Each of these actions signals the same thing: you are available to adjust. And once that signal is sent, it cannot be taken back. You can try to recover verbally, but the frame is already set. The negotiation has already tilted. This is why experienced operators protect their state before they protect their position. Because position means nothing if the state enforcing it is unstable. A clear boundary delivered in a weakened state will still be tested. Not because the boundary is unclear, but because the person holding it is. And here is where most fail to recognize the pattern. They review the outcome and focus on what was said. They analyze the logic, the wording, the timing of their responses. But they ignore the condition they were in when they delivered them. They try to fix language instead of restoring structure. But the language was never the problem. The problem was that the version of you present in that moment was already negotiating before the conversation began. The concession was already decided at the level of state. The words simply followed. This is why repetition is dangerous. Not the repetition of effort, but the repetition of compromised states. Each time you negotiate while tired, you reinforce a version of yourself that accepts that condition as normal. And over time, that version becomes dominant. You no longer need to be exhausted to negotiate. You begin to negotiate by default. Because the body has learned that standards are flexible, that pressure leads to adjustment, that holding the line is optional. At that point, discipline is no longer present as identity. It becomes situational. Something you access when conditions are favorable. And anything that is conditional will eventually fail under pressure. The pattern does not stop at external negotiation. It begins to restructure internal command. The same mechanism that lowers your standards with others starts lowering your standards with yourself. You delay actions you already decided on. You soften deadlines that were once fixed. You allow exceptions to pass without correction. Not because you reconsidered, but because enforcement requires energy, and energy is no longer available. So the system compensates. It replaces enforcement with justification. You begin explaining your own deviations in a way that preserves comfort. I'll reset tomorrow. This is temporary. I've already done enough. These statements are not neutral. They are negotiations with your own structure. And just like external negotiation, each one shifts the boundary further away from where it was originally set. This is how discipline collapses quietly. There is no visible failure. No single moment where everything breaks. Instead, there is a gradual widening between standard and behavior. A slow acceptance of misalignment that becomes harder to detect because it happens in increments. Fatigue accelerates this process because it removes friction from deviation. When you are alert, breaking your own rule creates tension. You feel it immediately. There is resistance. But when you are tired, that resistance weakens. The deviation passes with less internal conflict. And what passes without resistance becomes easier to repeat. Over time, the body learns a new rule: enforcement is optional when energy is low. That rule spreads. It moves from small actions to larger ones, from minor concessions to structural compromises. And eventually, it reaches identity level, where you no longer see yourself as someone who holds the line regardless of condition. You become someone who adjusts based on how you feel. At that point, fatigue is no longer required to trigger negotiation. It only revealed the pathway. Now the pathway exists on its own. This is why recovery alone is not enough. Rest will restore energy, but it will not automatically restore structure. If the pattern has been repeated, the structure has already been modified. The line has already moved. So when energy returns, you do not return to the original position. You return to the last accepted one. That is the cost. Most people believe they are recovering when they rest. In reality, they are stabilizing a lower standard. They feel better, but they operate from a reduced baseline. And because the drop was gradual, they do not register the difference. This is where discipline must separate from condition completely. Not as intensity, not as force, but as non-negotiable identity. The action is not debated. The boundary is not reconsidered. The presence does not adjust based on internal state. Whether the body is heavy or sharp becomes irrelevant to enforcement. Because once enforcement depends on condition, the condition becomes the controller. And fatigue will always arrive. What most fail to confront is that fatigue exposes hierarchy. Not the hierarchy you claim, but the one you actually follow. When energy drops, only the strongest structures remain active. Everything else fades. If your standards disappear under fatigue, it means they were never at the top. They were supported by surplus, not anchored in identity. This is where separation occurs. There are those who treat discipline as something they apply, and those who exist inside it. The first group negotiates when conditions change because discipline sits outside of them. It requires activation. It depends on readiness. When readiness is gone, so is control. The second group does not activate discipline. There is nothing to activate. The structure is already in place, independent of state. Fatigue may slow movement, but it does not alter direction. The line remains fixed because it was never conditional. This is not intensity. It is positioning. Position determines response before the situation unfolds. If the position is unstable, every new variable forces recalibration. Fatigue simply accelerates that instability. It increases the likelihood that you will adjust instead of hold. And adjustment, repeated enough, becomes default behavior. Look closely at when you start negotiating. It is rarely at the peak of pressure. It happens earlier. At the first sign of discomfort. At the moment the body signals resistance. That is where the decision is made. Not in the final exchange, but in the initial reaction. Fatigue lowers your threshold for that reaction. What you once absorbed without movement now triggers adjustment. And because the threshold is lower, negotiation begins sooner and ends deeper. This is why the damage compounds. You are not just conceding more. You are conceding earlier. And early concessions reshape the entire structure of the interaction. They set the frame that everything else follows. Once that frame is set, recovery becomes almost impossible within the same sequence. You are no longer holding position. You are trying to regain it. And regaining always costs more than maintaining. So the outcome is predictable. More effort, less control, weaker position. And the cycle continues because the source is not addressed. The source is not the negotiation itself. It is the tolerance for operating in a compromised state without structural protection. It is the decision to enter moments of consequence without ensuring that the identity enforcing them is intact. This is where discipline becomes preventative, not reactive. You do not wait to see if you will hold the line when tired. You remove the possibility of needing to decide in that state, either by predefining non-negotiables so deeply they cannot shift, or by refusing to engage in conditions where enforcement is at risk. Because once you are inside the moment, fatigue has already done its work. The negotiation you think you are controlling is already shaped. And from that point forward, you are not deciding. You are following the path that was set the moment your standard became flexible. There is a point where fatigue stops being a condition and becomes a filter. It determines which parts of you are real and which parts were only ever supported by comfort. When everything unnecessary is stripped away, what remains is not your intention. It is your default. And your default does not negotiate because it wants to. It negotiates because it has been trained to. Training does not happen in controlled moments. It happens in repetition under variation. If every time fatigue appears you allow standards to shift, then fatigue becomes the signal to adjust. Not consciously, but automatically. This is where most lose control without realizing it. They believe they are making decisions in real time. In reality, they are executing patterns that have already been reinforced. The moment fatigue is detected, the system begins reducing load. It looks for the fastest way to resolve tension. And the fastest way is almost always concession. Not because it is correct, but because it ends the demand. This is how negotiation becomes reflexive. You are no longer evaluating. You are minimizing. Minimizing effort, minimizing friction, minimizing duration. And in doing so, you also minimize standards. The entire structure compresses toward ease. What was once held firmly is now adjusted quickly, almost without awareness. This is why willpower fails in these states. Willpower requires activation. It requires a conscious push against resistance. But fatigue reduces your capacity to initiate that push. So anything that depends on activation becomes unreliable. Discipline, if it is real, cannot depend on activation. It must exist prior to the moment. Fixed. Embedded. Not something you reach for, but something that is already there, enforcing without effort. Because in a fatigued state, effort is exactly what you do not have. So the question is not whether you can hold the line when tired. The question is whether the line exists in a form that does not require you to hold it. If it requires effort, it will fail. If it requires thought, it will delay. If it requires motivation, it will disappear. Only what is structural remains. This is where identity becomes the only stable mechanism. Not identity as concept, but identity as constraint. A set of conditions that do not change regardless of internal state. You do not negotiate them because there is nothing to negotiate. There is no internal discussion, no weighing of options. The outcome is already decided before the situation appears. Fatigue can slow execution, but it cannot alter direction. That is the difference. Most attempt to strengthen themselves so they can perform under fatigue. But strength is variable. It rises and falls. It cannot be the foundation. Structure can. Structure does not require you to feel ready. It does not require clarity. It operates even when the body is degraded. Because it is not powered by the moment. It is defined before the moment. Without that, negotiation is inevitable. Not as failure, but as outcome. Because the system will always move toward what is easiest when nothing prevents it from doing so. What remains unexamined is how quickly recovery becomes deception. You regain energy, and with it, a sense of control. Movements sharpen. Speech stabilizes. The body no longer drags. And from that improved state, you assume the structure has been restored. It has not. Energy can return without correction. You can feel capable again while still operating inside a lowered standard. Because the standard was not tied to energy, it was altered during its absence. This is where the error compounds. You begin performing again, but from a shifted baseline. The same actions now carry less weight. The same boundaries are enforced with less precision. And because there is no visible failure, you accept it as normal. But normal has already changed. This is how erosion hides. Not in collapse, but in continuity. You continue to act, to decide, to engage, but each layer is slightly thinner than before. Not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to accumulate. And accumulation is what reshapes identity. Fatigue initiated the shift. Recovery concealed it. So you move forward believing you are intact, while operating from a compromised structure. And because the body feels better, you stop checking. You trust the state. You assume alignment. But alignment was never restored. It was replaced. This is why correction must be deliberate. Not reactive to how you feel, but anchored to what was defined before fatigue ever entered. You do not ask whether you feel capable. You verify whether the standard is being enforced at its original level. If it is not, then energy is irrelevant. You are still operating below the line. Most avoid this verification because it exposes a loss they did not register. It forces recognition that something shifted without permission. That the version of themselves they trusted allowed adjustment when it should not have. And that recognition carries weight. So instead, they move forward. They accept the current level as sufficient. They redefine the standard to match their behavior. And in doing so, they eliminate the tension that would have forced correction. This is the final stage of negotiation. Not with others, not with actions, but with reality itself. You no longer see the difference between what was and what is. You collapse them into one, and call it consistency. But it is not consistency. It is adaptation to a lower threshold. And once that threshold is accepted, it becomes the new reference point. Every future action is measured against it. Every decision is filtered through it. The original standard is no longer active. It exists only as memory. And memory does not enforce. By the time you reach this stage, the pattern is no longer situational. It is embedded. You do not notice the negotiation because it no longer feels like a deviation. It feels like how things are done. This is where discipline either reasserts itself completely or disappears as a concept. There is no gradual correction here. No partial return. Because the system you are operating in has already adapted to reduced enforcement. It will not restore itself on its own. It will continue to follow the most recently accepted structure, regardless of how you feel about it. So the interruption must be absolute. Not an increase in effort. Not a temporary push. A direct reinstallation of the original line, with no regard for the current state of the body or mind. The standard is not adjusted to match your condition. Your condition is forced to operate under the standard. Anything else continues the negotiation. This is where most hesitate. Because reinstallation carries immediate cost. You feel the resistance return. The friction increases. Actions that were easy become difficult again. Not because they are objectively harder, but because you are no longer allowing deviation to pass. You are restoring consequence. And consequence creates pressure. That pressure is what fatigue previously removed. It allowed you to move without paying the full cost of misalignment. Now the cost is back. Immediate. Non-negotiable. So the system reacts. It searches for exits. It attempts to reintroduce flexibility. It offers the same justifications it used before. Ease into it. Stabilize first. You don't need to be exact. These are not suggestions. They are attempts to preserve the adjusted structure. If you accept them, even slightly, the restoration fails. Because restoration is not built on compromise. It is built on exactness. The line must return to its original position, not close to it, not approximated, but exactly where it was before it moved. And it must be enforced immediately, not gradually. This is where identity is decided again. Not in theory, but in execution under resistance. You do not wait to feel aligned. You act in alignment and allow the system to catch up. The body resists, the mind delays, but the action does not change. Because the action is no longer dependent on either. It is dictated by structure. And structure, once restored, begins to overwrite the pattern that fatigue installed. Not instantly, but consistently. Each correct enforcement weakens the previous adaptation. Each refusal to negotiate removes one pathway the system relied on. Over time, the default shifts again. But only if there is no interruption in enforcement. Because the moment you allow fatigue to reintroduce negotiation, the system will revert. Faster than before. With less resistance. Because it remembers the easier path. This is why discipline, at this level, is not about strength. It is about refusal. Refusal to adjust the line. Refusal to soften enforcement. Refusal to allow condition to dictate structure. And that refusal must hold under the same condition that caused the failure. Fatigue must return, and the line must remain. Only then does the system change. There is no advantage in being disciplined only when you are at full capacity. That version of you requires no control. It operates with surplus, with clarity, with ease. It does not reveal anything. The real measure is what remains when those conditions are removed. When the body is heavy. When the mind is slow. When the instinct is to reduce, to avoid, to close the gap quickly and move on. That is where negotiation begins. Not as a tactic, but as a reaction to discomfort. If the line moves there, it was never fixed. Fatigue does not break discipline. It exposes whether discipline exists without support. If it disappears when energy drops, then it was never structural. It was conditional, dependent on state, reinforced by comfort. And anything conditional will always be negotiated. So the objective is not to eliminate fatigue. That will not happen. The objective is to remove its authority. To ensure that when it arrives, it does not gain influence over what is enforced and what is allowed. Because fatigue will always push for reduction. It will always attempt to lower the cost, shorten the process, soften the boundary. That is its function. And if there is no structure in place to resist that function, then negotiation is not a possibility. It is a certainty. So the line must exist beyond the body. Beyond how you feel, beyond how sharp you are, beyond whether you are prepared or not. It must remain where it was set, regardless of condition. Because once the line depends on condition, it is no longer a line. It is a suggestion. And suggestions are always negotiated.